2, 1. Good afternoon and morning to our American audience. Welcome to another webinar hosted by the America-Europe Chair on Technology, Innovation, and International Regulation. My name is Esther Zalen-Aldu, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Before we start, I would like to mention a few words about the chair. The America-Europe Fund strives to be a platform that supports academic cooperation, exchanges, programs, and research to disseminate and strengthen comparative knowledge of European and American societies. One initiative that supports our mission is the America-Europe Chair on Technology, Innovation, and International Regulation, which aims to provide interdisciplinary research and expertise on regulatory developments in Europe and America with a focus on technology, innovation, and international regulation. Through these activities will promote opportunities for cooperation and dissemination among stakeholders across the Atlantic. In today's discussion, we are fortunate to be joined by Ms. Giovanna Cellini, partner with Morgan Lewis and Bocuse LLP in Washington, D.C., where she leads the firm's global international trade and national security practice. In Berlin, Germany, we are joined by Dr. Laura von Daniels, head of the Americas Research Division at SWP Berlin. And lastly, but certainly not least, we are joined by Mr. Matthew Ettel, Special Assistant to the President and CEO at the Center for European Policy Analysis. In today's discussion, we'll mainly pass through the prospects of transatlantic cooperation on export controls for dual-use technology. In recent years, there has been an intensification of the use of export controls to target authoritarian actors and increasingly also to attain economic security. This has become a prominent theme to a degree amongst European and American legislators, showing that there's an alignment of interest. Therefore, questions arise on whether it is time for deeper transatlantic cooperation in the area of export controls. To understand this discussion, I would like to ask our panel about their thoughts on what events or trends led to the current resurgence of export controls of dual-use and critical technological goods. We'll start with Giovanna.
Thank you. That introduction was wonderful, and it is such an honor to be on this panel with such a distinguished colleagues. So you raise a very interesting question because export controls, at least from the United States, are cyclical. We go through phases where there is some intensity, and then we have a leveling off and some decline in the use of the tools, and then there is intensity again. And it is always driven, at least in the United States, from reactive policies. A situation happens and then a reaction occurs, and depending upon what that situation is, the reaction can be extreme, to be honest with you, which is what we're seeing now. We're seeing an extreme focus on export controls and to include sanctions. And then in other circumstances, it is less focused. I think part of the reason that we're seeing it is twofold. One, we have this natural cyclical environment. And every time it happens, we always have another player in the global community that is making attempts with intensity to lead in different technological areas. And we have seen this pretty much since the 1950s. It's been Japan, Germany, and now it's China. And part of the drive for the current intensity is both Russia and China. Russia with its incursion into Ukraine, which has unified people, and China with its intent to succeed in the technology realm across technologies that matter greatly, not only in the military and defense concept, but also in the civil world for health and telecommunications and financial reasons.
Okay, and we'll head over now to Laura in Berlin.
Yeah, thank you so much also for the invitation, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions we'll have. I would add to Giovanna's points that regarding the Europeans, I think on average, we generally have to say that we tend to be reluctant toward export controls. And that is for several reasons, good and bad, but certainly also for historical reasons. And I think it has a lot to do with experience during the Cold War and the COCOM times. And therefore, it took the EU a long time to re-enter the kind of cycle that Giovanna just described. And it really only did so when it felt the pressure in the situation where Russia was invading Ukraine. I think that was really, speaking of events, that was the triggering event. There might have been people who have thought of all of these instruments earlier on, but that certainly gave it a political push. So the EU started its own process largely in reaction to US policy towards Russia. And on Russia, it's true that the EU was more or less happy to follow, to use these instruments, economic instruments, anything short of war, own war towards Russia. And I think it was also seen as a certain degree of a diplomatic success that implementing own member states' export controls was seen by the US side as equivalent to US rules, and therefore the foreign direct product rule could be dropped. So, success story. Then on China, I think we have a hugely different discussion in Europe. And I think it has a lot to do with a certain degree of ignorance on the European side, that there have been events in China, that triggered US reactions, but that should also be worrying for us. Speaking of the Made in China 2025 and also the military civil fusion policies. So often in the EU debate, I think people tend to argue that we should or should not follow the US lead, but that is in a way ignoring the fact that there's an underlying root cause that led to US policy changes. I think I'd leave it here and look forward to the next question.
Okay, and Matthew?
So I'll attempt to be a bit of a bridge across the Atlantic, I guess, but SIPA is a DC-based institution. So we are, as both of my colleagues here have outlined, we're in a transformational period for export controls on both sides of the Atlantic, and kind of within both Brussels and national capitals across Europe. And I think from the US side of things, this has been a decades-long transition to kind of if you want to call it the Sullivan Doctrine of the way how the US utilizes export controls now. As Dr. Van Daniels pointed out, in 2015, you have Made in China 2025. And then in response to that, you have 2018, the U.S. Export Controls Reform Act, the ECRA, completely overhauls and provides permanent statutory authority for the U.S. government to promulgate these rules. So in 2019, the Trump administration kind of begins its campaign against Huawei, if you want to put it that way. Which began to utilize a lot of the tools that we see now as common, really for the first time in terms of the entity list, the inception of a lot of foreign direct product rules, and the Biden administration has really kind of continued this, and if not intensified it in a lot of different ways. And I think that a lot of the trends influencing this, you can look at. A lot of 3 specific speeches from Jake Sullivan. Your September 2022 speech, in which he kind of outlines it's now U.S. policy to stay as far ahead of China in technological advancement, not just a couple generations. Follows that up with a speech in October, kind of outlining the U.S. or the Biden administration's national security strategy. It's now about setting a small yard but a high fence around those critical technologies. And then in April at Brookings, National Security Advisor Sullivan outlined essentially what he calls a new Washington consensus, the Biden administration's new international economic agenda, in which the bottom line up front, It's security over sales. National security kind of begins to trump trade considerations. A lot of this largely driven by what the Biden administration sees as kind of strategic dependencies on a lot of kind of internationalized supply chains. China exploiting U.S. and allied technologies for civil military fusion policies, which both of my other panelists have pointed out, and also a motivation to kind of reshore critical production to the U.S., a hollowed out middle class, some of the things they outlined. So, it's important to view kind of U.S. It's important to view U.S. transformation to export controls policy as part of both a positive and a negative incentive game around the semiconductor industry. So, have both the U.S. and the EU's respective CHIPS Acts, and now you have the von der Leyen Commission beginning to kind of chart out what the future looks like for an EU export control regime.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. So, considering what you just mentioned, could you give our audience some of the examples of the recent legislative or unilateral actions that have come across in terms of legislative packages or even measures, both in the US and the EU? Let's start with the EU. Lara, go ahead.
Well, yeah, so there are different kinds of action. There are more or less collective EU decisions, and increasingly these days, over the past year, there have been national level, member state level decisions. So there was a broad consensus on the Russia-related export controls in 2022. And since then, we have seen on several occasions, individual member state decisions on other aspects of technology. And the most prominent example being in the EU case, the Dutch, the decisions by the government of the Netherlands to control the export of lithography machines, so machines that can produce semiconductors. And after that decision last year, and it followed a bilateral negotiation process with the US, there have been several other occasions, and the European Commission in a recent communication has listed those cases so everyone can look them up. So there were in May 2023 Spanish export controls on quantum computing and other emerging technologies. You had Lithuanian export controls. The Finns introduced something in November 2023. And all of that is based on the European Union's dual-use regulation that leaves space for member states' individual actions being taken. This being said, the European Commission has recently tried with a communication to engage in a process or initiate a process of, forcing all of the member states to make up their minds about whether a more centralized or more structured process of introducing export controls might be necessary for the EU for several reasons. One of them certainly being that the EU certainly would have a stronger position in all kinds of multilateral frameworks or bilateral negotiations also with the US on export controls if it had a common European voice and was capable of introducing the same kind of export controls and use the same export control lists in all of the member states, all of the 27 member states. That is currently not the case, but we are now entering a phase of intense reflection on that. And by summer this year, I think there's going to be a next step where the Commission will try to bind all of these different discussions together and come up with a new proposal. So that's the state of the art on export control decisions within the European Union framework.
Thank you, Laura, for that. Matthew, I remembered in your previous comments, you mentioned already some of the unilateral actions that the US has taken, but could you provide us some other examples as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I certainly commend the Commission's recent white paper on export controls as part of the broader economic security package. But I think it's important for us to kind of outline October 7th in 2022 as kind of the defining date that has kind of entered this new era, or entered us into this new era of export controls. So on October 7th, the Biden administration introduced a new set of a massive set of new export controls regulations aimed at limiting China's ability to acquire advanced semiconductors and advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So that introduction, October 7th, sparked a kind of a multilateral backfill, right? So bilateral negotiations with the Dutch government, as well as the Japanese government. That process was kind of kicked off by what Biden administration officials refer to as kind of leading from the front, if you will, on this. So the administration updated these regulations this past October in 2023, aiming at kind of closing loopholes, kind of fine-tuning exactly what pieces of manufacturing equipment are the controls apply to. But it's those two October dates, so October 7th, 2022, and then an update in 2023 are kind of the two flagship posts we have right now for US kind of export controls in this area.
Okay, and let's head over to Giovanna. Could you give us some concrete recent legislative or possible unilateral actions that could be taken at the US side? Because I know that you often give Senate hearings in the Foreign Affairs Committee. So yeah, would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yes, excellent observation. And I agree with everything that my co-panelists have said. So you are correct. The Congress in the United States has been incredibly active, not just through the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, but also the House Financial Services and the House Foreign Affairs Committees and the Senate Banking Committee. And what they have done is, through a combination of hearings, they have introduced over 45 different bills. Now, obviously, introducing bills is very different than having a law. But I think it's instructive that the bills seem to focus on three areas. And I'd want to talk about one called the Biosecure Act, another which was the Outbound Investment Act. And there's, draft bills, one by Congressman McCall and one by Congressman Barr. And then I do want to also mention the executive branch, because under this administration, President Biden has been incredibly active with executive orders. And executive orders can allow for the unilateral actions that the Congress cannot. And we see it in some of the outbound investment, and we also see it in some of the inbound investment, which is directly tied to export controls, because in the United States, inbound investment is managed from a technology perspective on our export control laws. So if you are controlled for export purposes, or you have emerging and foundational technologies, however those are defined, you end up with some inbound investment regimes. And then on the outbound side, you now have the Commerce Department being brought in to look at know-how, let's say, and tack that on to outbound investment. So the export regimes in the US have exploded. We even have sensitive personal data being looked at as potentially being subject by the Commerce Department. And I've been practicing in this area for 37 years. I never thought I would see that kind of expansion. And it is even a question legally, in my mind, to Matthew's point, under the ECRA. Yes, ECRA is very broad, as is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. But controlling personal information through an export regime at the Commerce Department seems to be quite expansive and perhaps difficult to sustain as a conclusion. It doesn't stop the administration from taking steps, and it now ends up Congress is acting as a gate on some of the different issues that the administration is trying to manage. And when we look at these, the biggest issue we see is funding. So the executive branch can have all these export laws, including the semiconductor and supercomputer rules that Matthew talked about. If we have the ICT, the Information and Communications and Technology rule, where they're looking at controlling more in that area. And if Congress doesn't fund those efforts, then we have unfunded mandates, but the requirements are still in the regulations, and that places industries in a bind. I think I want to close with one comment here. Matthew mentioned a Sullivan policy or a Sullivan doctrine about we need to be multiple iterations ahead in technology development, and two executive orders, 14083 and 14105, which deal with robust CFIUS and robust outbound investments. In both circumstances, the president embedded in those executive orders the idea that we are going to look at export controls and investment in terms of where technology leadership for the US will be going, not necessarily where it is today. And that to me is also extraordinary, because no one knows where the future will go. No one knows how China will proceed, or frankly, other countries. The United States is not the lead in everything, as the Australia Strategic Policy Institute's report indicated. In 37 technologies out of 44, China is in the lead. And we have others such as India and the UK and other European countries or Japan. So we need to look at this and say legislatively, there's a lot of acts. We're moving into biotech, we're moving into biomanufacturing, nuclear propulsion for a number of different applications. And AI has terrified everyone. So you look at all this fits and starts, and in the United States, we see a lot of activity, but not too much progress. On the congressional side, we see a lot of activity and implementation on the administrative side, on the executive side, and that is unsettling. And we'll see what the election brings us.
So considering what Laura mentioned, especially about the legislative discretion that member states also exercised and the expansive nature of the US control system that Giovanna and Matthew touched upon, what has been the impact of the increasing utilization of export controls? This could be in terms of the competitiveness of domestic and international markets. What about the impact on consumers and suppliers? Like, could you give us some concrete examples? And we'll start with Matthew.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think one of the easiest things to point to is kind of public stock data, if you will. So as you know, as all of these large semiconductor companies, ASML, NVIDIA, Intel, Micron, AMD, you know, go down the list. You know, as they report earnings, and again, this has been something that people have been keeping an eye on since October of 2022, right? How these public statements and how statements to the SEC, how these companies describe how this is changing. You know, all of them have been very coy sometimes to say that this is going to completely overhaul, you know, operations in China. But they have been forthright that it is going to kind of change certain supply chains. You know, one of the aspects of the Biden administration's kind of October controls is a novel control on how U.S. persons can interact with multinational corporations, with their Chinese operations. But you know, ASML has come out and said, or independent analysts have judged ASML as, you know, particularly impacted by this, could be upwards of 10% of their worldwide annual sales. After the last round of the last round of export control updates this past October, NVIDIA's sales took an almost 8% drop after they were announced. Overall, I think 30 chip stocks lost about a combined $73 billion in value over the span of a week. So you know, there's a pretty immediate impact kind of from people looking outside in, but you also see, especially NVIDIA, making a concerted effort to work within the rules to maintain some sort of market share in China. After the October 22 controls introduced a whole new slate of chips and GPUs to be able to sell to the Chinese market. That is in accordance with the controls. And in October 2023, we see a new slate of export controls that directly target that new slate that NVIDIA put out. So, this is going to be something as the administration remains committed to how these to kind of the underlying foundation of these controls. That we're going to keep seeing this happen. I mean, the Chinese market it's an invaluable income stream to companies that the administration has essentially said, hey, we are betting on you to lead the innovation race. We're going to try to buy you a few years in terms of AI innovation and staying at this leading edge. But it's a tight balance to simultaneously also take away a pretty large market share. And then you also have kind of retaliation from Beijing's side, barring Micron from US-based Micron from certain Chinese infrastructure, a variety of other critical minerals export controls from their side as well. So I'll stop there, but there have been a wide variety of things from across the globe to look at in this.
Thank you so much. And Laura, especially on the EU side, what has been particularly the immediate impact, and what do you foresee will happen in the medium and long term?
So on the immediate economic cost side, I think it might be a bit too early to say, because the export controls have just been in place since the beginning of the year. But it's funny, I just looked up the ASML, so the company that was most hit, their stock market price, it seems to be developing well since the beginning of the year. So that might be an indication that it was not too terrible a cost yet. But I think the main worry is something that Matthew already mentioned. On the EU side, I think you have lots of worries about retaliation also in other areas of the economy. So it might not be an eye for an eye, but for something different. And so that is the main worry. And that's why you see a country like mine, Germany, probably taking a bit of a reluctant position on having further export controls or connected investment controls, because there's lots of investment in China. And so the worry is that in the medium and long term, costs could be really high. And also, I think that's been an argument that was made by the chip producing companies or ASML as well. The costs for producing chips might increase, and that will hurt our economy. So these are the main cost considerations, I think, on our side of the pond at this point.
And Giovanna as well, I know that you, especially during your practice, you advise a lot of multilateral companies that operate in these critical global value chains. So could you also tell us their perspective of what they see will be the implications, especially in the medium and long term?
So that's an excellent question. So I think there's three observations. In the short term, we are seeing a lot of reticence to expand operations in China, but at the same time maintain what they have. And it's a very delicate balance because, of course, with the need for visas, if you're transferring employees there, or exit visas if employees are leaving, and funding and customers in China, as well as research and development collaborations, it's a very, very intense and sticky situation to decide how to balance it. So people are looking to maintain their investments, frankly, in anticipation of perhaps the situation ameliorating itself at some point. On the other hand, though, we are seeing this intense need or decision on some multilateral parts across industries to de-risk, and de-risk with a degree of speed because when you de-risk, you have to shift your resources elsewhere. So it becomes capital intensive, resource intensive in other jurisdictions, and looking for where and what jurisdictions can allow you to shift quickly and make the transition seamless. So there is a lessening of economic impact has become a big issue in multilaterals. The third is what Matthew and Laura touched upon, this concept of retaliation. And it's interesting because, as I said, I have been doing this for 37 years, so I have seen other retaliatory measures. The difference is China perceives itself to be in a comfortable position at this point, where it is at the fulcrum of so many different elements, whether it's critical minerals, low to medium end supply chain, research and development. It is willing to expend incredible resources at the government's expense to press forward with research and development, both legitimate and candidly less legitimate. And so given the power of the government, the centralization and the consolidation, a lot of people are saying, even if the situation ameliorates itself, until there's a transition in leadership, which is less personality focused and more diffuse, these inconsistencies are likely to continue. So we have actually seen some incredible investments in other jurisdictions in the region, whether it's Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Australia, even further off into India. And so that has shifted the calculus, and I think it's letting China look at retaliation differently. And so, yes, they make a splash with the Micron US. They made a splash when they named Lockheed Martin and Raytheon for its stance on defensive weapons to Taiwan. But at a very practical level, business level, even a policy level, those were more optics than concrete actions. So we're seeing a de-risking, we're seeing some decoupling, some shifting, and an attempt to maintain a balance in China so that whichever way it goes, the industry will be able to take some steps, either to remain in country, or if they need to divest, they'll be in a position to do so, because no one wants the divestment disaster that happened in Russia. That was an incredibly important lesson for the industry and the economic community and even the governments. The damage caused to the economies across the globe from the manner in which the sanctions and export controls were implemented is a valuable lesson to the extent it is relevant for China as well.
Right. So considering the fact that Matthew and Giovanna have touched upon the expansive nature of the US export control regime, Laura mentioned how the EU allows a degree of policy space for member states. So there have been a lot of unilateral measures. So considering this overall picture, what gaps remain within the current EU's export control regime? This could be in terms of governance, coordination, efficiency, and enforcement. Laura, go ahead.
Wow. So I think the EU is just entering that process of evaluating the gaps and how to close them. But certainly there's an increasing awareness or beginning awareness of certain red lines that we see or that we derive from our own European national interests. And I think when it gets to expanding export controls, of course, there are worries that it might touch on areas such as energy technology and climate technology. And I would say that is where the EU sees a red line, because we are so dependent on it currently on the continuously good relations in that area, given that we are, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in the biggest energy crisis ever that we've ever experienced. So I think that gives you a sense of where the discussion might be leading. We do have, I mean, the EU has always, for a long time, followed multilateral export control lists, and you have sort of a common sense on that, and it continues to be there. But when you move on from that, when you try to define what exactly is critical technology or more emerging and foundational technology, I think there's still a lot of work to be done within the group of 27 countries, and then also in relations with others like the US. So more work, it's ongoing, I think, on that.
And just quickly as a follow-up, are there particular EU member states that are taking the charge, or is this also influenced by current events and also the strategic thinking that has been happening at the Commission, especially with the open strategic autonomy? Yes, Laura, Laura, the question was directed to you. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you just repeat that? I had a difficult connection just now.
Yeah. As a follow-up, do you think that the current reassessment is led by particular member states, or was this a process that was already undergoing, especially in light of the Commission's own strategic thinking around open strategic autonomy and now increasingly as well on economic security?
It's hard to say. I think there's an increasing willingness of the member states, especially when you talk on the so to speak on the working level, to engage in these discussions on a European in a group of European members. But it's certainly mostly driven by the European Commission, which has set herself the agenda of being a geopolitical European Commission, and has come up with this whole concept of economic security and a strategy related to it, and now with specific suggestions on how to implement, including export controls, investment screening, and outbound investment control. So I would say at this point it is driven by Brussels, but there's more awareness, I think, now that we need to have member states need to have their own opinions on these things, because eventually down the road there will have to be political decisions. And again, this is an area, a policy area that cannot be decided by the Commission herself, but that needs member states support or implementation. And yeah, so we're getting there.
Thank you very much. In contrast as well, Matthew and Giovanna, you mentioned the expansive nature of the US export control regime, especially now involving with personal data. What gaps do you see, especially from your professional field and from your experiences within the current US export control regime? And again, this could be in terms of governance, coordination, efficiency, or even enforcement. Giovanna, we'll start with you.
That's an excellent question. So I have seen three primary gaps. The first is the point that Laura touched upon. We really do not understand the classification that applies to emerging and foundational technologies. We see criticality in trying to manage technologies that have applications that are disruptive and also incredibly useful across applications. And yet the US government is not devoting adequate resources to the classification side. And so what is happening is the Commerce Department that manages dual use and the State Department that manages defense-oriented military intelligence and some dual use items because of their application, they're staying within a lane of trying to touch the edges, but they're not really dealing with exactly what do we mean by emerging technologies. And it's interesting because for the last 5 years, Congress in the National Defense Authorization Act has included definitions of emerging technologies and has also granted a role to our Department of Defense in identifying these technologies. But that has been done only for limited purposes, and the Biden administration has made concerted efforts to keep DoD sidelined. They have literally excluded them from everything, for example, from the Disruptive Technology Task Force that is managed by Justice and Commerce, as well as CFIUS and export licensing decisions. So it's a very interesting dichotomy. But it also leads to the second gap, which is the administration has an overemphasis and a misallocation of resources on enforcement. The Assistant Secretary for Export Enforcement, Matthew Axelrod, has been one of the most active in issuing policy statements through memoranda, sometimes even touching up against making regulations without going through the Administrative Procedures Act. And they have been incredibly focused on pursuing aggressively civil and criminal enforcement. The difficulty is they are looking at cases from 2012 and 2015 and 2017 and bringing them forward to today's environment and not understanding that the key to enforcement is understanding where the risks are today. And so that misallocation is taking resources away from classification and putting them on to enforcement, which creates uncertainty in the community. And it's not uncertainty just in industry. It's now reached into the academic and nonprofit world. And it leads to my third comment. As I said, I've been doing this a long time, and the export laws have never, ever required compliance programs. And especially in the research and academic community, where a large number of advancements occur, whether it's with government funding or through internal research and development funding, there has been a broad focus on looking at that research community as managing fundamental research. Assistant Secretary Axelrod changed that with his memos of October 2022 and March of 2023, where he literally put a statement in and said industry and academia must have compliance programs. And he changed the bar, which has impacted collaboration efforts, has made parties a little bit more hesitant to pursue different types of activities, and that can be economically and technologically damaging if it is not balanced against exactly what are we trying to protect. And that is the gap. I don't believe, at least the United States, has truly focused on what are we trying to protect and why.
Matthew, what's your take? What are particular gaps that you see within the current US export control regime? And also do feel free to also look at the EU side, because I know you look at both systems as well in your research.
I think for both Brussels and Washington, there's kind of a long list of questions that we should be asking ourselves as the EU embarks on a new era of economic security, but as the US kind of explores how to fine-tune these rules moving forward. I think when you talk to both US and EU policymakers in this space, they devote a lot of worthy time to talking about how the EU-US Trade and Technology Council was extremely helpful in aligning approaches to export controls on dual-use technology towards Russia in the wake of their full-scale invasion. Every other week now, I feel like we see an article that comes out about Western-made chips still being present in Russian drones that are being flown into Ukrainian apartment buildings and markets. I think there's a broader question there of kind of enforcement and what lessons need to be learned, not only to kind of close those gaps in the Russia and Belarus regimes, but also what needs to change for a potentially tighter one towards other regions. The Bureau of Industry and Security within the Commerce Department, I think, is probably one of the more important U.S. executive bureaus that most people have never heard of. But maybe not so in the export control space. But they have been kind of launched into this new realm of importance, and they're this kind of this new tier of importance, and they frankly do not have the funding allocated to kind of match the importance that's been put on them. So I think kind of providing BIS the resources needed to, properly enforce, do the classifications, but also have kind of the market intelligence needed to do, proper end use screening or a variety of other things. I think, and this is getting to Giovanna's point earlier about kind of what's next for US export controls. Looking at data, looking at cloud computing, looking at quantum, but I think especially in kind of the semiconductor space, RISC-V, how as the screws tighten, how does the US approach kind of open source chip design, and things of that. So the open source question, I think is pretty open as well. But I think there's also a bit of a question that needs to be asked around I'm going to attempt to pronounce this word. It always goes somewhere between poorly and not, but the extraterritoriality question. This is something that our European allies have chafed at for a while, and it's an open debate. But foreign direct product rules are only as relevant as the presence of US inputs in these systems. And I think there's a broader question that needs to be asked, kind of weighing short-term gains, long-term consequences. The past 2 October rules have undoubtedly increased or encouraged China to double down on kind of indigenizing production for a lot of these things. A lot of ASML's recent earnings boosts have been from China stockpiling a lot of lithography equipment before these rules go into place. There's also the open question of legacy chip production. What happens if China dumps all of these kind of mature nodes? Are the EU and the US prepared for that? So, I do not have answers to any of these questions that I just posed, but I think there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of things on both Washington and Brussels' plate, but I think from the U.S. side of things, I think there's a lot of cheering going on for Brussels' kind of growth in this area. But all of the initial steps have been good, and I think there is kind of a broader alignment is moving. There is growing alignment, both from G7 level to Brussels to member states. A lot of good work, but work left to do.
Excellent. And that leads to my final question, which is, considering all that we've discussed, how likely can we foresee a common position, if possible, a framework on platforms like the G7 on export controls amongst EU and US legislators and policymakers? Laura, we'll start with you.
All right. Well, it depends on lots of things, but essentially, I think it depends on the outcomes of elections in Europe and in the US that we will see this year. So in the spring or early summer in Europe, the European elections that will then lead to a new commission eventually. And obviously the US elections and their outcomes. Because we have seen, if you look back at the Trump years and the Biden administration years, huge differences in the way that US allies and economic and political partners were approached by Washington. And we already talked about extraterritorial application of US law. That was not working well during the Trump years. I think we have discussed it a bit less during the Biden administration years, although it continued to happen, right? The FDPR was still around, but there was less complaining on the European side. But that had a lot to do with alignment in many other areas of international politics and also economic policy. So depending on these factors and the constellations you will see, I think you have better or worse conditions for common approaches. The EU Commission, this standing commission now, the von der Leyen Commission, is certainly taking steps to prepare more cooperation, I think, to get the Europeans in line, to get to more common positions on certain things. But it is a slow process in Europe in particular, with the 27 member states and no real political decision-making process that could structure a more unified policy consensus at this point. You know, we need to get to that first before we can have common positions. And then, of course, you still have member states that can use their veto power. So even if you got to a point where you had common rules or ideas on what to regulate and what not, what to control, there can always be one of our member states that would block that. You know? So that's difficult. And I also think that if there was any kind of a more extreme scenario in international politics, and here I'm just mentioning Taiwan and anything that might happen around Taiwan, that could then again give a huge push to common rules making, independent of who's in power. Because, I mean, just looking at the Russia case, I think you would find similar reactions in Taiwan, in a bad Taiwan scenario. Not the same, it wouldn't be the same, but at least I think it would give a push to decision making on the European side. But nevertheless, what we really need, I think, and that's my final point, what we really need to get to more common decision making or rules making is a discussion, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic about norms. Because we have hugely different traditions. The European Union member states are not ready to use economic policy instruments to achieve foreign policy, security policy goals yet. They were able to do that in the one case, in the Russia-Ukraine case, and everyone agreed. But it's not. I think we didn't see a transformation in the norms debate yet in Europe, and I think that would have to be the basis for any kind of transatlantic way forward. So they need to come closer together. I think both sides on the norms, on the rules of what is, what specific policy goals are we trying to achieve, and what are then the appropriate economic instruments to be used, and what are boundaries, what are red lines, and we need to have agreement on that.
Thank you, Laura. And Giovanni, and then Matthew.
So I agree with what Laura said. I think commonality will be driven by a few factors. One, how important it is to avoid conflict. And I don't mean economic conflict, I mean actual conflict. Whether it is in settlement in the Far East, whether a blockade of Taiwan, other more aggressive actions, or even less aggressive actions where there is not force landed on the island, but there could be cyber attacks or exfiltration of data. And so I think that if we see the desire overwhelmingly to avoid conflict, I can see that economic instruments and commonality of purpose between the EU and the US will take on an urgency. And the second is, of course, timing. And the EU has done some extraordinary things in the last several years, and they have moved forward on export controls, sanctions. They actually have member states that are enforcing sanctions. I had a colleague in the UK that said she'd been practicing 20 years and had never seen an enforcement case. Same thing in France. And so I think we see timelines changing because the needs of the different communities are being driven together by a common enemy, so to speak, and a common goal. I do agree with Laura that norms are important because we are not aligned on all foreign policy or national security purposes, and we don't have global enforcement mechanisms. And candidly, we've seen it in the WTO or when it was GATT. Global enforcement is not currently, in my view, on the horizon. There have been some attempts by the US, for example, the alignment among the Five Eyes countries to have common enforcement goals. There was a policy note issued by the Commerce Department, does reflect, but the Five Eyes group is already aligned in one circumstance with a high degree of commonality that does not exist yet with the US and the EU. So I think the need to avoid or limit or eliminate a conflict, an actual conflict, the timing for that, and then how much, to Laura's point, calling it norms, or what do we want to do with enforcement? How are we going to manage that? I think are going to be some of the factors that drive the alignment between the US and EU.
And Matthew, you have the final word.
Don't want to add too much more here. I think it's especially around kind of semiconductor focused export controls. But this is true of all, everything that's included in these kind of critical and emerging technology lists. Answering the multilateral question is extremely important. And I know we're focused a lot, we're focused on EU-US here. But, we need to figure out a way to bring in major players in these industries: UK, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Netherlands and Germany being within the EU, but also being very important kind of bilateral actors here. I mean, I think there needs to be a serious examination of kind of the future of multilateral export control coordination, specifically the Wassenaar Agreement. The fact that Russia is a member and Taiwan is not, I think that kind of sums up a lot of the issues with it at the moment. So, I think for the US and the EU to move towards a common and effective vision for these export control conversations, I think there needs to be, it can't just happen between Washington, Brussels, Washington member state capitals. Need to bring in G7 partners, G7 plus partners, and kind of envision what does it mean for democracies as a whole to want to maintain the lead in technological innovation, because we're facing an increasingly dangerous international order, or dissolving international order, depending on how you want to put it. So it's very important for not just the EU and the US to be aligned on these kind of things, but make sure our close allies and those who are just as important, if not more important, in a lot of these supply chains to have a say in the process as well. So that's what I'll end on.
Great. Well, due to time constraints, we only have time to answer one question. We have a question from Mila Gooden, who basically asks, do you believe the EU should adopt the US approach and use export controls as an instrument to reach other policy goals, such as targeted sanctions on specific sectors in China? 30 seconds each. We'll start with Laura.
The easy one. I have a personal view on that. I do think it should be part of a toolbox, but it won't help you that's my opinion, and perhaps might eventually be an opinion uttered by the government of Germany, because you do need those 27 member states. And therefore, I think it just goes back to the norms debate. We have to need that first, and we can't take ages to have it, but we need to have agreement on that. And then we can provide an answer on your question that is more helpful.
Okay, and then we'll go with Matthew, and then lastly, Giovanna. 30 seconds each.
Yeah, I guess just a quick personal reaction to that. I think there needs to be some more evaluation of kind of the the long-term implications or unintended consequences of kind of how the US is approaching these rules. So at the moment, I guess a succinct answer would be maybe, we'll see, but need to look at things a little more closely.
And let me end with an inflammatory answer. I think it should be no. The US is currently in a state of flux. It is pursuing multiple policies on a number of different factors that are likely to change. And there's too much push-pull going on. So for the EU to move in that direction or adopt wholesale, I think would be less helpful and frankly, potentially deleterious to the global order, so to speak. So my short answer is no.
Amazing. Well, I think we should leave it there as we have approached the end of today's webinar. But I'd like to especially thank our panelists, Mr. Leedy, Dr. Von Daniels, and Mr. Attell, for the insights and expertise into this complex but important discussion. It has certainly left us with more food for thought. And thank you, our audience, for your participation and questions. I really hope you enjoyed this webinar. I wish you all a wonderful week, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you all.